All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Saunders. I work for the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation in Kenora, Ontario, and I'm here with our Executive Director, Todd Sellers. And we're both very excited to offer the Ask an Expert seminar series. Some of you may have attended the series last year, and it was such a roaring success that we decided to bring it back for a second year. This is our second in a 5-part series of lunchtime webinars where we connect the scientists and resource managers who are doing good work in the Rainy Lake, the Woods Basin with you, and let you hear what they're studying, what they're finding out, where they're going with that information. Before we start, and I hand it over to our speaker for today, Jesse Anderson with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, I want to just run through a couple of the basics of our Zoom webinar, just so you're familiar with some of the options that you're going to have for asking questions, etc. So just taking a look at this first screen here, you'll see number one there, the Q&A button. This is where we'd really appreciate it if you would enter in writing any questions you might have. You can do this at any point during the conversation. You don't have to wait for Jesse to finish his presentation. We'd like to see the questions come in as you think of them, and then we'll address them during the Q&A session. If you want to raise your hand to ask a question, you can certainly take that option as well. In both cases, we certainly would like to hear you ask the question yourself. And if you'd like to enter information into the chat to speak with somebody else that's at the webinar, that's great, but we won't be monitoring this on an ongoing basis for questions. We'd rather that be in the Q&A, please. And you will need to mute or unmute yourself to ask a question, and the moderator can help you with this. So that's it. I'm sure we're all well versed in Zoom terminology. So with that being said, I think we'll move into the presentation, and I just want to welcome everyone here from all places that have joined us today. This is going to be really interesting as Jesse gives us information on what they've found to move towards a plan for identifying and addressing excess phosphorus in Lake of the Woods and its watershed, and the years that they've been diving into this. So just to let you know, if you're not familiar with who Jesse Anderson is, he's a research scientist with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency out of Duluth. He conducts water quality monitoring and assessments for the state's surface waters, and he's worked on water quality issues on Lake of the Woods and the Rainy River Basin watersheds since 1998. So welcome, Jesse. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to folks today. I'm the agency's messenger on a very large project that involves many people, many organizations, many partners. It's quite complex. But yeah, I want to spend the next 25 to 30 minutes giving you an update on 20 plus years of study that our agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and our partners have done to try to understand Lake of the Woods issue with excess phosphorus and how to get the lake on basically a pollution diet to try to reduce the amounts of algae that are in the lake. Before I start, I want to thank a lot of people. My coworker on this presentation, Carrie Hernandez, was the MPCA's project manager for the Lake of the Woods Impaired Water Study in Minnesota. Nolan Baratono, longtime MPCA employee, was a Lake of the Woods coordinator. Mike Kennedy, a project manager. We've had many great local partners. Mike Hurst at Lake of the Woods County Soil and Water Conservation Office, and Baudette was our local project sponsor. The consulting firm that we used, Respec, great scientists, great folks. Jeff Kramer, Julie Blackburn, Bruce Wilson had a huge hand in this study, and many, many partners that I'll get into, but I specifically want to call out the great work of the Red Lake Nation Water Resources Program and Shane and Chl-a with helping us out today. So as I mentioned, I'm going to attempt in the next 30 minutes or so to summarize 20 plus years of study. Our project has over 35 authors and contributors. Um, I want to give you folks a brief introduction to the lake, its complexity, Minnesota's water quality assessment process, talk about our impaired waters study and scientific modeling process we use to understand the phosphorus sources and budget in the lake. Again, go over that accounting process, talk specifically about some of the reductions needed so that the lake can meet Minnesota's water quality standard. Basically, we have to put the lake on a pollution diet. And how do we do that? I want to talk about some challenges and opportunities into the future. And this is long-term. There aren't many easy fixes here. That's part of the message. So there are some good news and bad news scenarios that I'll summarize. Talk about what's going to happen in the near future and how we continue to work with the many partners, particularly internationally, to understand this complex lake. I'm going to be summarizing a 200-page document called the Lake of the Woods Total Maximum Daily Load Study. You can just Google MPCA Lake of the Woods and you should be able to find it and download it and read it at your leisure. It's quite detailed. I'm going to take a high-level summary of you today, but the raw files are online at the website below. As I mentioned in the outset, we have many partners. You can see I ran out of space in our partnership slide. Folks from US and the Canadian government, tribal partners in the United States, First Nations in Canada, Ontario government, federal agencies in the United States like the US Geological Survey and the Forest Service, state agencies in Minnesota such as the Minnesota DNR, the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. Counties here in the state have done tremendous work, and I'll get into that a little bit. And then, we're all under the umbrella of the IJC and the great work of the foundation as well. And Kelly and Todd sort of keeping us together. There's just many partners involved. That's a key message. So you guys, I'm sure, are well aware of the lake and the water quality challenges out there, but it's quite a resource for our two countries and the folks that live around the lake and love to recreate. It's a world-class recreation destination, a world-class fishing destination. I looked up some figures just before this presentation. And in 2019, in just one county in Minnesota, Lake of the Woods County, $44 million was spent in leisure and hospitality in 2019 in just one county in Minnesota alone. So I think there's something like 200 resorts on the lake, and it's just a tremendous resource, fishing both in the summer, particularly in the winter. But as we know, it can have too much algae. That photo on the right of a young boy throwing stones and with his dog swimming in the background. Unfortunately, that dog passed away a few years ago after swimming in the lake. And it's suspected that the dog succumbed to toxin poisoning from algae blooms. So there's a real issue with these algae blooms, and we all have to work together to try to get a handle on them. So as I mentioned, seasonally, the lake, particularly the southern basins of the lake, shared with Minnesota, Manitoba, and Ontario, has too much algae. Nuisance conditions of algal blooms are observed in the southern waters nearly every summer and fall over the past 20 plus years. You can see from those photos what's typical in summer and fall. Those are not conditions that I'd want to swim in or recreate in. So basically, the work that Minnesota, particularly my agency, the Pollution Control Agency, does has its foundation in the authorities of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water Act of 1972. And we have authority to, we've been given authority from the US EPA to administer our water quality standards. And they're based on beneficial uses of Minnesota's waters. Are the waters safe to swim? Are the fish safe to eat? Is the quality sufficient to support aquatic life? Can the water be used for industrial purposes, et cetera? For Minnesota's lakes, we've developed regional water quality standards for phosphorus, algae, and water clarity to protect swimmable use, and I'll get into that. Lakes that aren't meeting those standards are declared impaired, and a detailed study and investigation called a total maximum daily load study is required under federal regulation, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Our agency has developed regional water quality standards for lakes based on aquatic ecoregions. All lakes in Minnesota are not created equal because of Minnesota's diverse land cover and geology. So we've developed separate lake water quality objectives depending on what portion of the state that you're in. And even though Lake of the Woods is located in the northern Minnesota wetlands ecoregion on the northern border of the state with Canada, most of the watershed of the lake drains the northern lakes and forest ecoregion, that area straight to the east. And that's the area that's very rich in lakes. And we have one specific water quality standard for cool and warm water lakes for phosphorus, chlorophyll, and Secchi transparency. Phosphorus is our key parameter here. This is the total phosphorus component. And our standards are based on a June through September summer average concentration of no more than 30 parts per billion. The lake, if it exceeds that value based on at least 2 years of monitoring, and it also exceeds one of the two other response variables, either it has chlorophyll A in excess of the standard of 9 parts per billion, or a Secchi transparency standard less than this 2 meter or about 6 foot standard, it's placed on the impaired waters list. And you can see Lake of the Woods, based on 3 summers of detailed monitoring, which was also supported by monitoring by our partners, including Ontario Lake Partners Program and many other folks, including Red Lake. Other folks in the same parts of the lake came up with very similar answers. So we were very confident that the Lake of the Woods was not meeting its standards, and we declared the lake impaired in 2008. So when you do that, you have to do this total maximum daily load, or a TMDL. I don't like acronyms. This is the only acronym slide you're going to see, but this is the nature of our administrative process. What is a TMDL? Well, it's several things. It's a plan, it's an equation, and then it's a report. But really, it's a calculation to the total maximum amount of a pollutant, in Lake of the Woods case, total phosphorus, that the lake can receive and still meet its water quality standards to protect its designated use, in this case, swimming. Another way to look at it, it's a detailed accounting of all the lakes and its watersheds' phosphorus sources and what reductions we need in that entire area to meet our standards. So again, I'm giving sort of a scientific Reader's Digest summary of our plan here. Our impaired water study put the total phosphorus sources into 2 main buckets, because this is the foundation of these TMDL studies, or total maximum daily load studies. 2 main buckets. The first one is called waste load allocations. These are permitted point sources from treated effluent, whether it's a city's wastewater treatment plant, a large industrial facility such as a paper mill, or other things. So we have those point sources, and our agency has authority under the Clean Water Act to develop limits for those facilities, for those wastewater treatment facilities. The other large bucket of phosphorus sources is called the load allocation. And this is the largest bucket. These are all other large sources, so such as rivers and streams that flow into the lake, and the Rainy River, its largest source of water and sediment. Other sources such as atmospheric deposition, dry and wet deposition, such as rain and snow on the lake surface, and then things like internal recycling of phosphorus within the lake itself, which is a key part of the lake's phosphorus budget. And then on top of this is a layer of called a margin of safety to account for uncertainty. There's always uncertainty with these models that we used, as well as a component called reserve capacity to account for future growth. So to understand the lake, it's important to understand its environmental history. And not that long ago, in the middle part of the 20th century, the Rainy River, the lake's largest source of water and nutrients, was severely polluted and impacted from pulp and paper effluent from 2 large paper mills on the shores of the river, as well as the 2 largest towns in the area, International Falls, Minnesota, and Fort Frances, Ontario. And starting with environmental regulations in the 1970s in both countries, the amount of wastewater discharged to the Rainy River that reached the lake dramatically declined. The chart on the upper left is from a study from Hargan et al. In 2011, showing the clear decline in loads of total phosphorus discharged to the Rainy River from the 1960s to near present day. And you can see the dramatic decline, which is, we're very confident that that's due to mandated improvements in wastewater treatment, both from industrial sources and municipal sources. And that photo on the bottom is from a 1950s state of Minnesota study showing some poor fellow digging his way through feet of industrial pulp and paper effluent to try to get at the river. You know, those days are gone. That stuff has made its way down the system. Some of it might still be in the lake. We don't know. We think most of it's gone. But the river today is a high quality river. It's clearly recovered, but not that long ago, the Rainy River was one of, if not the most polluted river in the state of Minnesota. The other thing to know when studying the lake is to know that it drains a very large and diverse watershed, 70,000 square kilometers, or about 25,000 square miles of a very diverse landscape, from an area near Thunder Bay of the boreal forest. Most of the land above Fort Frances and International Falls that drains Rainy Lake is a high quality area with a lot of protected land in parks and wilderness areas. And then the landscape changes a little bit as you move west, but it's a very large watershed. Even though the Lake of the Woods is about 1 million acres, it drains a very large watershed, and it makes understanding these sources of phosphorus very involved. So we knew early on that we would have to divide the lake and its watershed into several ways, and I'm going to summarize that in the next few slides. We divided the watershed into 3 main segments. The area in pink is the area that drains to Rainy Lake above the dams in International Falls and Fort Frances. And in this part of the watershed, which is over half of the watershed, we've defined it as a boundary condition, and we are proposing no reductions in that area within Minnesota because it's a high quality area. Nearly all the lakes and streams are meeting water quality objectives. And so we have no reductions within Minnesota above the area in pink. The area in green is the lower Rainy River drainage area. Those are streams and rivers that drain to the Rainy River directly. The largest rivers are in Minnesota. the Little Fork, Big Fork, the Rapid, and the Baudette. But as Dr. Eimers pointed out at last week's seminar, there are some important tributaries, although they are smaller, in Ontario that drain directly to the Rainy River that we're starting to get some important information on based on their great work. And then the last segment of the watershed is the area in yellow that drains to the lake directly outside of the Rainy River through smaller rivers and direct drainage to the lake. So in addition to dividing up the watershed, we also divided up the lake into these main basins because of differences in depth, morphology, and some minor differences in water quality. Lake of the Woods is actually several lakes in one, and we actually modeled the lake in an area that extended beyond the international border in the Northwest Angle area. We extended it to the outlet of Little Traverse Bay in the Big Narrows area of Ontario, sort of that pinch point that drains the entire watershed and the southern basins of the lake before it gets to the areas of central and northern Lake of the Woods. So we connected the conditions in our models to all these basins, and our model output is the outlet of Little Traverse Bay at the outlet of Big Narrows, and this includes some portions of the lake outside of Minnesota, as you can see on the map there. So in quick summary, in 20 plus years of work, many people collected hundreds of water samples, including some great citizen volunteers throughout the entire watershed to help us really understand phosphorus and algal dynamics in the whole area, Minnesota, Ontario government, tribes, etc. We did some preliminary lake modeling, as well as our partners at St. Cloud State. Scientists at UMD did a very detailed paleolimnology assessment of historical algal communities in the lake. They took cores of the lake at several locations. The Science Museum of Minnesota, great folks there, did a very detailed study to try to develop a historical nutrient budget. It's outstanding work. It was foundational for our TMDL to set a goal of trying to understand the dynamics of phosphorus movement, particularly in the southern basins of the lake, and principally Big Traverse Bay. Our partners at the University of Minnesota did some updated land use mapping using satellite imagery. Dr. Bill James at University of Wisconsin-Stout did some excellent detailed work of phosphorus release rates from sediment cores in Big Traverse Bay. Took cores, took them back to his lab and measured how much phosphorus was released under certain conditions to help us understand that. And then our partners at the Respect Consulting firm basically put the report together. So in summary, what did we find out? Our modeling period is a 10-year period from 2005 to 2014. And on average, over the 10-year period, this is where our estimate of where the phosphorus is coming from, the sources of phosphorus that reach Lake of the Woods. And I'll go quickly counterclockwise, documenting these sources. The first one in yellow there is the waste load. Those are the permitted point source facilities, primarily in Minnesota, but there's at least one large one in Ontario. That's about 9% of the phosphorus. Septic systems is a very small proportion of the total load, even though there are thousands of individual septic systems along the lake. Collectively, it's a very small source when you look at the big scale of the big watershed and the big lake. Not to say that it's not important. Every kilogram of phosphorus is important, but septic systems as a whole are a very small proportion of the pie. Tributaries or rivers that flow into the lakes, about 40% of Lake of the Woods phosphorus budget. The Rainy River is about 90% of that blue bar. 2% is that black bar of direct runoff into the lake outside of stream channels or from islands. Again, that's about 2% of the phosphorus. Shoreland erosion from War Road, Minnesota, around the southern shore of the lake to the confluence of the Rainy River near 4 Mile Bay is about 9%. That was based on an engineering study looking at several key parts of that large area of about 70 miles of land. There's quite a bit of that area of the lake that large chunks of the shore are going into the lake. And then this big component of internal load or recycling within the lake itself is about 35% of the phosphorus, a little over a third. And then lastly, our biggest source is atmospheric deposition, basically rain and dry deposition on the lake surface. So because it's a 1 million acre body of water, that's a pretty large source. So in summary, again, our water quality goal is 30 parts per billion as a summer average from June through September. That's not to say that any given day or week we might exceed those standards. Our standards are based on a summer average. So in order for us to get to that goal, we did our accounting and summed up the total amount of phosphorus that's in the lake from all those sources, about 886 tons. Our models tell us that for the lake to be at 30 parts per billion, we have to be at about 723 metric tons. So what's the difference there? About 162 tons. So we need about an 18% reduction combined from all the sources to reach Minnesota's water quality standards. So from the beginning, we knew we'd get lots of questions about what does this mean for Canada, because it's an international water and an international watershed. So there are two main sources of reductions in Canada that are in our TMDL. Obviously, the state of Minnesota has no authority of implementing reductions from Ontario rivers or Ontario wastewater treatment facilities, whatever they are. But it was important for us to recognize during our TMDL process that the large paper mill in Fort Frances, Abitibi, was idled at that time. So we accounted for that in our plan because it was a reflection of what actually happened. The amount of phosphorus from that facility discharged to the Rainy River declined dramatically by about 90% because the plant was idled. And right now that facility is in the process of being demolished. So that plant was idled. We put that in our TMDL because it was an actual reduction. The other Ontario or Canadian reduction in our TMDL is our modeled flushing of the historical nutrients that we think are in the bottom of the lake from the decades of discharge before environmental regulations took hold. That portion of the lake within Canada that's slowly going to flush through the system. So those are the only reductions within Canada that are in our TMDL. All the other reductions in our TMDL are within the United States. So just briefly, a couple tables looking at these numbers. We have our two buckets of phosphorus pollution. The sources, whether it's waste load, again, those are permitted wastewater sources. There's about 90 tons per year, about 10% of the total. We need to reduce that by about 48% to get to our goal. The other main bucket are loads, which are basically all other sources. Again, primarily rivers that flow into the lake and the Rainy River, internal loading within the lake itself, and atmospheric deposition. we need about a 15% reduction in that source, because that's the largest bucket. That's about 95% of the load. That's why you see we need 120 ton reduction at that source. And so you add all this up, there's our 18% reduction from those two sources. Last table here, again, understanding the reductions by country. This is what we wanted to share and what our Canadian partners wanted us to explicitly list in the TMDL. Our sources by county or by country, about 37% of the load is coming from Canada and 63% from the United States. That's a little bit flipped from the drainage area contribution, but that's because most of the watershed above Rainy Lake comes from Canada. Most of the large sources of phosphorus in the portion of our TMDL that we modeled are from those large rivers that originate in Minnesota. So that's why most of the reductions are in the United States. We've broken this out by sector. The orange bars are our goals. The blue bars are where we are in present day. And those boxes on the right just show us our reductions by sector that we need to get to. And I'll get into this a little bit at the end. Before we dive into a little bit more of the details, it's important for us at the PCA to lay out some expectations, and that there are many fundamental challenges ahead of us with restoring this incredibly complex lake. There's lots of government challenges. There's over 25 government agencies involved. Canada does not have a TMDL program. The province of Ontario has a different phosphorus objective than Minnesota. There's good reasons for that. We have to recognize that. The lake has very different conditions from south to north. So how do we come up with a goal or goals when the lake is very different and there's different authorities throughout the lake? The lake has a very complicated science, and I'm attempting to summarize that today. As you'll hear in a future talk from Adam Heathcote at the Science Museum, the flushing of the system from historical acts decades ago is going to take some time. It's going to take decades for this lake to get to where we need it to be. Climate change is a big deal in Lake of the Woods. It's a very sensitive lake. That chart on the right is some great research from Kat Rulin showing that just since about 1965, Whitefish Bay in Ontario has had about 28 days of increased periods of ice-free time because of less severe winters and earlier spring. So if the lake's like a greenhouse, imagine if you're a farmer and you had an extra month to grow corn or to grow algae. And so the lake is responding to that. And then lastly, we know that Lake of the Woods is naturally very productive. Going through some of the old documents from the explorers and the folks developing our borders from the 17 and 1800s, they documented algal blooms. So we know historically the lake had blooms. So this slide is just to illustrate the tremendous amount of governance challenges we have ahead of us. There's good reasons for these levels of government, from international to IJC at the top, all the way to citizens at the bottom. It's an alphabet soup of a lot of folks working together to try to do this, and it takes time. So let me get into some good news here about how we're doing on our plan. First, all 19 point source facilities, whether they're industrial facilities such as the large paper mill in International Falls or small to medium-sized wastewater treatment plants within Minnesota, they're all meeting their reduction goals in the TMDL, which is great news. The Rainy River is a high-quality river now. It's clearly meeting the state's water quality goals for phosphorus for northern rivers, and it's a high-quality river. Our impaired water study has spurred further research and collaboration with partners. A couple of examples. We knew going into this that the Little Fork River in Minnesota was a disproportionate source of phosphorus to the river. And our partners at the USGS, as well as county partners at Chl-a, Itasca County, have been working for the last 2 years on a sediment fingerprinting study to understand the sources of sediment in that watershed and where they're from, and does the phosphorus stay in the river, stay on the land, or go into Lake of the Woods. There's another larger study proposed by the USGS that's in the proposal stage to try to expand this out into the Rainy River for about 600,000, and hopefully that gets funded, but we'll wait to see on that. And then you guys heard about the great work that Ontario has done with their tributary monitoring from Catherine Eimer's group through Environment Canada funding. So administratively, the EPA approved our TMDL this past summer. It was held up for a couple of years due to some pretty minor issues in COVID and some other things. ECCC's great work, Environment Canada, great work on their 4-year science plan, greatly increased our understanding of the lakes. And one of their 3 reduction scenarios is in very close alignment with Minnesota's reduction plan, about an 18% reduction. We have a long history of working with our Canadian partners, going back over 100 years with the Boundary Waters Treaty. And we were very strategic at the beginning to involve as many partners and our Canadian friends as possible to help us all work together to understand this lake. And I believe we have a shared vision of the lake's health and shared issues and challenges moving ahead. Right now, from the state's perspective, we're waiting on what Environment and Climate Change Canada's plan will be, as there are 3 proposals before we dive into the details about shared water quality goals and reductions. So just a couple more slides on some good news. Environment Canada's near real-time satellite monitoring of algal blooms is unbelievable. On a weekly basis, we're getting real-time snapshots of how much the lake is covered with nuisance algal blooms and how that progresses throughout the summer. And the good news is that Canada's trigger for an algal bloom is very close to the state of Minnesota's chlorophyll A standard. So if it's not in blue in that figure on the right, it's likely that the lake is not meeting Minnesota's chlorophyll A standard of 9 parts per billion of chlorophyll. So just last week, you can see most of the southern basin of the lake, no surprise, is relatively green. So, but to have this is amazing. It's going to help us track progress. So what's next? As I mentioned, we're going to continue to work with our partners with the goal of developing shared reduction targets and water quality goals. Our partners at the Science Museum of Minnesota and the Red Lake Nation Water Resources Program, at least for this year, are continuing some really innovative work with stratification of the water column in Big Traverse Bay and what that means for internal loading. And so I encourage you to check out the November 2nd presentation on this research. The reductions in our TMDL are directly going into water quality planning processes that the state of Minnesota is doing in our watershed through our One Watershed, One Plan project, through a project with Lake of the Woods County and Roseau County. So there are specific projects related to shoreland protection, lakeshore cleanup, and targeted BMPs. And the reductions in our TMDL are in these documents as we work to protect the lake. Our large river monitoring program is ongoing every year for the foreseeable future. The MPCA and our great local partners at Chl-a and Lake of the Woods Soil and Water Conservation Districts are taking numerous phosphorus samples in the Rainy River, as well as the large Minnesota tributaries to the Rainy. So we're going to have very detailed information on phosphorus loads in these systems into the future to help us track conditions and progress. And then lastly, we continue to hope that we can develop a cooperative plan for long-term monitoring in consultation with our partners and the IJC's board, the Watershed board, the objectives and the alerts process, the core monitoring group. There's a lot of momentum. This is the long view. It's a complicated lake with complicated solutions. I know that's not the answer that some folks want. They want the quick fix. I'm sorry to be sort of the messenger of some bad news. There are no quick fixes for this lake, but we can continue to make progress. And we hope in the next few years to find some funding to collect some additional cores in Big Traverse Bay to see if our modeled reductions in the TMDL based on the past coring work that the Science Museum and other folks did is leaving the lake as modeled. That's a goal that Carrie and I have moving forward. So we're working on it. It's a huge lake, very complicated. So I'll end with a nice fall scene out there.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Incredible amount of work that's been done, and you condensed it and made it really easy for us to understand. So thank you. And as always, I'm always so grateful and impressed with the cross-border communication that happens with these large projects. I know it's the only way to get the good answers that you need. So thank you for a great presentation. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but certainly opening it up for questions now. And we have some time, so if there's a burning question in your mind, please forward it to Jesse.
It would be helpful, it's Todd speaking, if you use the raised hand button at the bottom so we can unmute you.
So Todd, I see that Terry's put a question in the Q&A. Would you be able to unmute him? All right, well, failing that, I'll just ask the question on behalf of Terry Reese. And by the way, Terry is with the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association. He says, given the complexity / challenge, is there a timeline for meeting the phosphorus reductions?
Yes, our TMDL has set a 25-year timeline. As I mentioned, there are no quick fixes here. It's going to take a long time for us to do this. It took a long time for the lake to get impaired, and it's going to take a long time for it to get cleaned up, given the complexity of the science out there. So we've set a restoration goal of 20, 25 years into the future. That doesn't mean we can't start to try to identify and address the sources, and we're doing that right now. But our plan has an end date approximately 25 years into the future.
We have a question. David Malaher had his hand up, and if he's unmuted, if he could go ahead, please. Please unmute yourself, David.
Trying. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you, David.
Thank you. I was just starting to write a note. Thank you, Jesse, for a fast run through 20 years. The question I wanted to ask is about winter. Do you conduct monitoring, water monitoring in the winter? And if you do, Do you have any interesting observations in difference besides the temperature, difference in the water quality in the winter versus the summer?
That's a great question. We don't routinely do water monitoring in the winter. As I mentioned in the beginning, our water quality standards for protecting swimmable use apply, for obvious reasons in the summer period of time, June through September. There are some portions of this TMDL that are amenable to winter work, such as taking cores on the lake surface. It's a lot easier to take a lake core under 3 feet of ice being transported out in a bombardier versus trying to do it in 4-foot waves in the summer. So some of the cores were collected in the winter. Some of the sensors may be in place in the winter, but as a general rule, our water quality standards, at least for this use, to protecting swimmable use and algal blooms, apply in the summer, that June through September period.
The reason for my question, Jesse, is that there's only sort of 6 months time passage between the summer and the winter. And I'm just trying to assess whether that summer conditions can be predicted in the winter.
That's a very good question. And I think Environment Canada has looked at that a little bit in some of their science plan work. The southern basins of the lake have about a 1-year flushing period. So it takes about a year for the water from all the sources to get into Big Traverse Bay and go over the dam at Kenora on average. So given that, it is important for us to understand that time frame, but for a lot of reasons, a lot of them being logistical. And again, because our work is foundational to our water quality standards, and our standards apply in the summer. That's why we're out there, principally in the summer. Not to say that what happens under the ice is not unimportant. It clearly is, because as that algae from the previous fall dies and goes to the bottom of the lake, it can decompose over the winter, consume oxygen, affect the phosphorus cycle, and affect conditions the next spring, summer, and fall. So it's certainly an area that we want to study more, but administratively, our work is primarily focused in the summer months.
Thank you.
We have 2 questions from Andrew Burton in the Q&A. If he's able to unmute and ask.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So I guess my first question is, Lake of the Woods has experienced an increase in toxin-producing blue-green algae blooms despite significant reductions in external phosphorus loads to the lake since the mid-1980s. Is it likely that controlling algae blooms on Lake of the Woods is much more complex than meeting phosphorus and chlorophyll A objectives?
I think the short answer to your question is yes. There's a lot we don't know about these algal blooms. It's some million-dollar questions in the field of limnology, like what are the environmental conditions that cause not only the blooms to start growing, but to produce the toxins that can make people and pets sick. And there's a lot of really smart people across the world trying to understand that. We don't know the answers to that in Lake of the Woods right now. We do know the lake is very sensitive to climate change, and that the Rainy River, even though it's a high quality resource now, it's sensitive to increases in phosphorus, particularly bioavailable sources of phosphorus that can quickly feed the algae and cause blooms. But again, our water quality standards are promulgated on that total phosphorus fraction. We are very interested in the bioavailable and soluble reactive forms of phosphorus because they're driving the engines of algal productivity in the lake. But at the end of the day, administratively, our goals are related to total phosphorus and total chlorophyll. We want to reduce those nuisance conditions of pea soup, as you saw in some of my introductory slides. But clearly, it's a very complex issue. We've got a good handle of things, but there's still a lot we need to know collectively.
Yeah. Is there a significant or a very strong relationship between the two in Lake of the Woods, chlorophyll A and phosphorus?
Yes, there is. It tracks very well. Typically when phosphorus is exceeding Minnesota standard, chlorophyll is also. Clarity is a little bit of a confounding issue because how clear Lake of the Woods is on any given day when you're out there is influenced not only by algae, but by the natural tannin or bog staining from the large amount of wetlands that flow into the lake from Minnesota, Ontario, and Manitoba. So that's a little bit of a confounding factor. We're studying that in more detail, but clearly when phosphorus is high, algae is high.
And the last question I have is in regards to the atmospheric deposition, which you mentioned was approximately 6% of the phosphorus load to the lake. I guess how did you come up with that number, and what sort of samplers did you have out on the lake to collect rainfall and atmospheric deposition?
The estimates, I want to make sure folks understand they were the best estimates we had at the time, or from a study from about 2008 that a consulting firm did across the entire state of Minnesota based on a detailed analysis of long-term atmospheric deposition monitoring sites throughout Minnesota. There were only a handful of stations in the Lake of the Woods vicinity. And so they were based on actual numbers. But that's one of the things that we want to get a good handle on. We know there is excellent data in places like NLA at the Experimental Lakes area, and our partners at the Science Museum have some really interesting hypotheses about potential underestimation of dry deposition of phosphorus from windblown sources from the prairies and agricultural areas to the west of the lake that may have complicated our atmospheric deposition sources. So short answer, it was based on real data, but we would like to have more sources of dry and wet deposition data, and we're hoping to tighten that up into the future.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thanks for the questions, Andrew. We're going to move on to Terry Reese. He has a question. Terry, are you able to ask?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks, Jesse and Kelly and Todd. It's always interesting to see all the great work that's gone on, and don't want to be that guy that's asking yet another question about all the million questions you've already tried to answer. But just curious about the loading, and internal loading such a significant amount, and over time with warming, I think we expect that's probably going to be changing. So I just didn't know how that got figured into your calculations, if at all.
Yeah, we're really interested in that. And with the climate change, there's a little bit of a confounding, there's some confounding issues, but basically it's obviously projected to be warmer and less ice-free periods and stronger stratification, which probably means that Big Traverse Bay might temporarily stratify more. And I encourage you to listen to Dr. Heathcote's talk in a couple of weeks. I'm sure I'll have more information on this. But with the warming climate, with more stratification, we might see more recycling of phosphorus from the bottom waters of Big Traverse Bay when the lake temporarily stratifies during short periods of hot, sunny, calm weather in the summer. We know from our modeling that that can be up to a 30-fold increase in recycling rates from when it's typically not stratified, or typically where the oxygen is about the same and the temperatures are about the same from the surface to about 9 meters in depth in most of Big Traverse Bay. But during those short periods of temporary stratification, we've seen in Lake of the Woods that it can have a short-term impact on algal blooms, and in other lakes that the Science Museum have studied in shallower lakes, smaller lakes in southern and in other parts of Minnesota. They've actually seen that these periods of temporary stratification in shallow lakes has been the driver to algal blooms. A few days of hot, sunny, calm weather, the water body stratifies, lots of phosphorus is released from the bottom and recycled into the surface, feeds the algae, and you get an algal bloom a day or two after that. We don't know if you can specifically connect the dots in Lake of the Woods because it's so much bigger and so more complicated, but they have documented that in some other lakes. So we're concerned about climate change. Definitely, it's going to make our road to hoe a lot tougher.
Thanks.
Any other questions out there? All right, I am not hearing any, and I don't believe there's any hands raised. So perfect timing, just a couple of minutes to 1. So I think we'll wrap up, but I'm sure if people come up with a question after, Jesse would be more than willing to answer by email. And oh, I see something's coming to the Q&A. 1 second. Oh, thanks, Terry. I would like to thank Jesse so much for his years and years of dedication to understanding this watershed and to sharing it with us today. A really integral part of our Ask an Expert series. So thank you very, very much, Jesse. And thank you to everyone who joined us today in the excellent questions. If you know of someone who wanted to make it today, but couldn't, the recording will be up on the Foundation website, same place that you registered for this, in a couple of days. Or if you'd like to access the recording yourself, it's there as well. So I would really like to say thank you to everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next week, and a special thank you to Jesse. Take care, everyone.